I've been working as a police officer for the city I live in for the past 3 years. Being in my mid-20s, I'm one of the younger officers in my area. I live in a somewhat smaller town. We have enough people to justify quite a few businesses, but it's much more quiet here than your average city. For this very reason, we aren't exactly overstaffed when it comes to our police department. On an average night, we'll have 1 or 2 officers out on patrol, with another officer or 2 back at the station. There's always a couple of us on call as well. We take reports and do other administrative work at the station, but that's about it. We do also book individuals at the station, but if they're not being released afterwards, we transfer them over to the county jail or whichever facility is appropriate. The only exception would be tossing someone in one of our 3 small cells to sleep off a hangover when they get a bit too rowdy from the drinking. So, what I'm getting at is that usually nothing too crazy happens here most nights. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked at night. I'll admit that after a while, I did get a little too comfortable in too many situations. There was one situation in particular that I'll never forget. When the call came in, it was reported that there was a home invasion. Dispatch was able to provide me with the man's cell phone number, so I gave him a call when I was on my way. The man answered and told me that he had left his house. He said that when he had gotten home, he began hearing a woman talking and moaning like she was distressed. He said the voice was coming from the bathroom, which had the door closed. He was obviously taken by surprise and felt extremely uncomfortable, so he left immediately and called the police. I thought that was a pretty understandable reaction to the situation. He gave me permission to enter his home and asked me to call him once I was finished there. A couple minutes later, I showed up to his residence. He lived in a smaller home and told me the woman was upstairs in his bathroom. I entered through the unlocked front door and immediately made my presence known. A woman replied by telling me to leave her alone. Her voice was a bit strange, but it did sound like a woman. I proceeded upstairs and walked over to what I assumed was the bathroom, since I was able to verify the noise was coming from that location. I asked the woman to leave the bathroom voluntarily, as it would be safer than me entering. She was no longer responding to my requests at this time, so I was forced to enter. I first opened the door and took a step back, while trying to get a view inside. I did not see anyone at this time, but did note there was a few spots where the individual could have been hiding. As I entered the bathroom, I began scanning any areas where she could have been, and at that point noticed there was a second bathroom door, which I assumed led to the bedroom. Once I was able to confirm that the suspect wasn't hiding anywhere in the bathroom, I proceeded to head towards the open door, which she must have exited through. Just then, the door slammed shut. I tried opening it, but it was locked from the other side. Instead of busting open this man's door, I decided I would exit the bathroom through the door I entered in. But as soon as I began walking to that door, it also slammed shut. And just like the other door, it too was locked from the outside. I tried breaking the door down at this point, as I was left with no other option, but it seemed to somehow be reinforced. I definitely found it odd that these doors were able to be locked from the outside, and began to think that the homeowner themselves were somehow involved in this. It took me several more attempts, but I eventually successfully got the door to give way. I unholstered my weapon at this point, and began clearing the rooms upstairs one by one. The rooms upstairs were clear, so I headed downstairs to check those rooms as well. Once I got downstairs, I immediately saw a man to my left standing in the kitchen. With my weapon in hand, I told the man to get on the ground. To this day, his reply absolutely shocks me. He started laughing and said it was a joke. He then said, "Officer, help me," while imitating a woman's voice. I raised my weapon up and again demanded he got on the ground in a much more aggressive tone. That seemed to do the trick, and I was able to place the man under arrest. The man ended up being charged with assaulting a police officer, which is a felony. He was also charged with a couple misdemeanors, but they were later dropped. The man ended up being found not guilty by reason of insanity and was committed to a state mental institution for an indefinite amount of time. I have not followed up on his progress since the sentencing, but I would agree that it had a proper outcome. This was definitely, without a doubt, the scariest and weirdest experience I've ever had as a police officer, and it has changed the way I handle calls forever. This is a story in which I wish to remain anonymous. I've worked in law enforcement for over 20 years as of writing this. This was earlier in my career, although I don't want to specify exactly when. I was working as an officer for a relatively large city. One evening, I was called to respond to what turned out to be a rather heinous domestic assault. When the woman called, she said her boyfriend wouldn't let her leave the room she was in, and that the man was torturing her infant in the other room. Domestic disturbance calls can be some of the most dangerous calls to go on since emotions can run so high. Luckily, I had a partner with me that night, but we still used an extra amount of caution. When we arrived at the residence, the man answered the door and was taken into custody without incident. At this point, we spoke with the victim and gathered all of the pertinent information regarding the case. It turns out that an argument ensued between the victim and the assailant. After he ended up throwing her around a bit, he locked her in the bedroom and made her listen to him torture her infant son, who he was not the father of. Thankfully, it appeared that he was only pinching or scaring the infant, but I still looked at him as a monster for what he did. I'll admit, I remember thinking that I hope he got placed in general population in county jail. You'd be surprised at some of the things that happen. At many jails and prisons, guards or deputies will purposely put an especially heinous inmate in Gen Pop and might accidentally talk about the person's charges just a little too loud for another inmate to overhear. Anyway, we bring the guy to the station, book him, and drop him off at the county. There was probably more emotional damage done than physical, but the case still bothered me. The inmate ended up being brought in for questioning. After he was transferred over, a young officer was assigned the task of questioning him. He was a new officer. He had a different title, basically a type of a junior officer, but stating the exact title would provide more info than I'd like, as different cities use different ones. When some of the other officers went to go check on the progress of the interview, they found the young officer unresponsive on the ground, and the suspect had apparently fled on foot. As far as any of us know, the suspect was still handcuffed, and we used all available resources to begin searching for him. Luckily, the suspect was indeed still cuffed in the front, and therefore he wasn't able to make it very far. Within 2 hours of escaping, he was back in police custody. The CCTV recording of the interview showed the suspect as he appeared to be trying to demonstrate some sort of a reenactment of the crime he was accused of. While doing so, he took the opportunity to catch the young officer off guard and throw his arms around his neck. He spent the next several minutes holding the officer in a chokehold from behind, and then made his escape immediately after. Unfortunately, the young officer suffered extensive oxygen loss to his brain during and after the assault, and died as a result 2 days later. Because of this, the suspect's charges became much more serious. He also became hated, among others on the police force. To make things even worse, The suspect took any and every opportunity to boast about what he did anytime he came across an officer from our city. This obviously made a lot of us upset, and we would talk about the things we wish we could do to him between us. The county jail where this man was housed is ran by both police officers and correctional officers. Although he was placed in administrative segregation and confined to his cell 23 hours a day, he loved to use his 1 hour per day of rec time to talk about what he did to the officer. We all did our best to ignore him, until one day when a high-ranking officer from our district went in to get a few things done at the jail. I wasn't there that day, and I honestly don't know what happened, but it's not too difficult to figure out. The suspect that killed the young officer was found dead in his cell the following morning when he didn't respond to the CO who was bringing him his breakfast. The official story is that the evening before, during the hour of rec, several other inmates went into his cell and beat him to death while the COs were distracted. They then put him in bed to make it look as if he were sleeping to cover their tracks. No charges were ever filed. Everyone knew what really happened. There's an unwritten law among police officers. We don't turn on our fellow officer and report them. For one, none of us had anything more than suspicions about what had actually happened. And two, even if we did, we all believed that man got what was coming to him. That young officer that died had his entire life ahead of him. He did nothing wrong and didn't deserve what happened to him. Sometimes the legal system truly doesn't work right on its own. And other times, people intervene and set the record straight themselves. I'm a police officer in Mexico. To say the least, being a police officer here is stressful and comes with more than one type of danger. There's a lot more corruption among officers and government officials here than there are in most other countries. With different cartels having their influence with so many different people and organizations, you never really know whose loyalties lie where. Some people are straightforward and only work for themselves. Some work for one cartel and some work for another. Unfortunately, our police officers here don't always have each other's backs the way they should. If an officer has ties to a cartel, they will always choose the cartel, even over their fellow officer. This, of course, is out of survival, but I don't have any sympathy, because I have always chosen to be one of the straight-laced officers. I do not work for anyone aside from the department I took an oath for. I follow the rules and I don't abuse my power. Believe it or not, I'm in the minority. Most officers here are corrupt on some level. If they don't have ties to a cartel, they accept bribes. If they don't accept bribes, they turn a blind eye whenever they like it. The list goes on and on. I've never claimed to be a perfect police officer, and I never will, but I at least intend on having integrity and trying my best. Since I am in the minority when it comes to the way I do things, you can imagine that I'm not the most popular guy around, which is okay. I'd rather have self-respect than friends. But it wasn't my lack of popularity that resulted in my most terrifying experience of my life. When I am investigating a crime, I do not treat a suspect differently if I find out they are a member of a cartel. Like everyone else, they are Mexican citizens, and I am a police officer. I've been in quite a few dangerous situations, but only one truly sticks out above the rest. Quite a few years back at this point, I was investigating a local murder. I quickly was able to determine that the individual responsible was a known cartel member. At that point, every other officer wanted nothing to do with the case. The man who committed the murder wasn't on the run. He was doing nothing to hide at all. Most cartel members think they are above the law, and most of the time it's because they are. So, locating the man was easy. I arrested him, just like I would do for anyone else. He was later acquitted for the murder. There was plenty of evidence, but obviously the prosecutor and/or judge residing over the case felt it was in their best interest to stop pursuing the charge. A couple months after I made the arrest, I received a call to some apartments in a bad neighborhood. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary about the call. A woman called, describing her husband to be abusive, and asked for help. I was familiar with this set of apartments and regularly got called here for a variety of reasons. It was business as usual. I pulled into the parking lot and started looking for the specific apartment number. At this location, there are 4 L-shaped buildings, making a square with a parking lot in the middle of it. There are 2 driveways leading in and out of the parking lot into the main road. About 30 seconds after pulling into the parking lot, shots began ringing out. I could tell right away that the shots were aimed at me. I knew this was an ambush and tried looking for an escape route. The driveway I entered through was already blocked by a van. I looked at the other driveway and saw there was no vehicle blocking it yet. I could tell that my car was getting hit by bullets from multiple angles. I was at a big disadvantage, and my only reasonable response was to run. I kept my head down and took off for the unblocked exit. As I was nearing it, I saw one of the men firing at me. He was holding an assault rifle and began walking into the middle of the driveway to block my path. I immediately recognized the man. He was a member of the same cartel that the man I arrested for murder 2 months prior was. I'm not sure why he thought blocking my path would stop me. I was being shot at, so obviously I was panicking. I pressed down on the accelerator and aimed right for him. He tried diving out of the way at the last second, but he was not fast enough. I struck him as hard as I could and sent him flying through the air. Gunshots were still ringing out, and I drove like hell to get out of there. I was very fortunate that day, and was not hit by a single bullet. My car was full of bullet holes, several even in my headrest. I think God was watching over me that day, because there were so many close calls. I learned soon after that the man I struck with my car, a known cartel member, had ended up dying from the accident. This resulted in me becoming an even higher priority on the cartel's hit list. I think God has since only continued to look down on me since that day, because I was able to avoid being killed for the next 6 months. After that point, I gained legal entrance into the US as a resident, where I still work as a police officer. The cartel could still certainly get at me here, but it is much less likely that they will. I 100% believe that if I had stayed in Mexico, I would not be alive to write this today. I've been a cop for almost 8 years. I'm definitely not looked at as a rookie at the station, but there's a lot of guys who have been there for decades. Over the years, I've definitely seen a lot of crazy stuff. Psychotic breakdowns, people acting insane because they're high on a certain drug, tons of horrible, brutal crimes, you name it. But there's one night in particular that I'll never forget. As a cop, I investigate things and determine the best course of immediate action. I'm not a detective, but I still look into things just like any other officer. Things usually get figured out, maybe by me, or maybe by other officers who look into the case further. I always believed that everything had a reasonable, rational explanation. You just had to look hard enough. But my belief of the world and everything surrounding it changed in the fall of 2012. My partner and I were patrolling a neighborhood outside of Portland, Maine. It was October, and as you can imagine, it was dark and cold as we got the call just before 10 p.m. The complainant stated that they noticed noise and what appeared to be movement inside a building near their home. This particular building was undergoing renovations. Apparently, many years ago, it was a tuberculosis hospital. It eventually turned into a psychiatric hospital, and then finally a school. It sat abandoned for many years until someone finally bought it and began to renovate. The dispatcher was actually able to track down the owner of the property while we headed there. They confirmed that no construction worker or anyone else should be in the building at that time of night. The owner also gave us direct permission to enter the building and explained a couple easy ways for getting in. For that reason, I assumed that some kids had gotten into the building as well. Being under construction, it had quite a few easy ways to get in, and it wouldn't be the first time I would be called to make some kids leave a property they were trespassing on. The other alternative I considered was that it might be a homeless person or a drug addict looking for a spot to get their fix. Regardless, assumptions were just that, assumptions. So my partner and I, of course, used full precautions upon arriving at the location. From the outside, the building looked to be unoccupied. We walked around the perimeter and shined our flashlights up into the building, but we didn't see anyone or get any type of a response. The building was indeed quite easy to gain access to. The entire place was completely gutted. Upon gaining entry, we made our presence known by shouting that we were the police and asking anyone inside to identify themselves. Still no response. As we headed to the end of the first floor, I began to doubt that there was anyone there. I figured either the caller was mistaken or whoever was here left before we arrived. Still, I kept my guard up. When we got to the second floor, we checked every room. My partner checked the doors on the right, and I checked the doors on the left. There was no sign of anyone on the second floor either. When we got to the third floor, we did the same thing again, and just like the second floor, we found no one. I radioed back to dispatch that it appeared to be all clear. My partner and I began making our way back downstairs, but when I got back down to the second story, I froze in place on the stairwell. I happened to look up and noticed that every door on the second floor was open. My partner obviously noticed this as well, and we both immediately looked at each other. We both asked the other if he was sure they closed the doors after coming out of the rooms, and both of us swore we did. I radioed the update of the situation, drew my gun, and began checking all the rooms on the second floor as quickly as possible. Towards the end of the hall, we still hadn't found anyone, but our attention was immediately directed towards the downstairs, where it sounded like a dozen pipes had fallen over and crashed onto the floor. We both hustled downstairs to the direction of where the noise came from, but there was nothing there. Not only could we not find a person, but we couldn't even find the materials responsible for the noise we both had just heard. We were discussing how insane this was, when once again, our attention was called elsewhere. Above us, seemingly on the second floor, we began hearing doors slam. Not just one. It sounded like the entire second floor had all their doors being slammed. I was already on edge at this point, so I'll admit that I was straight up scared. I didn't want to go upstairs, and my partner probably didn't want to either, but we had no choice. We rushed upstairs, assuming we were going to find a gang of people pulling a joke on us, but again, there was nothing. Once we made it to the second floor, the doors went silent and motionless. All of them were completely shut. At this point, we knew something unexplainable was going on. We quickly checked all of the rooms one more time and got out of there as quickly as possible. We didn't include everything in our report that night. It wouldn't have done any good mentioning it. And despite the fact that both of us knew for a fact what we heard, we both still knew no one would believe us. Even we were doubting ourselves at times. If it weren't for the both of us experiencing it together, I think I would have just assumed I was going crazy. I still have no explanation for what happened that night. I guess there are certain things out there that are just unable to be explained. Maybe one day we'll know more about them, and maybe not. I've been involved in other calls and cases where my life was probably in a lot more danger than it was that night. But regardless, nothing, absolutely nothing, has scared me the way I was scared that night.